Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet. Welcome back, Father.
Well, Colleen, always a great joy to be back with you after traveling in the mission field.
I feel like we've been beginning all of our podcasts this way lately because you've been traveling so much, but it's very good to have you back here in the studio. So
thank you. Yeah, I'm preparing for the rest of the year for the different missions that are happening. So, I hope our audience is keeping us in their prayers.
Yes, definitely. Which ones do you have coming up?
So I have one to the Philippines that is forthcoming, and that's going to be a pretty extensive mission because I'm directing a priest retreat for the Archdiocese of Palo, which is about 250 or so priests. And then after that, we have a program for seminarians and healthcare workers. And while I'm directing the retreat, Doctors Brian and Lagaya will be actually doing other programs in the Philippines. So it's a great mission, great opportunity.
And this was the one the Archbishop specifically said that you were going to be there, right? I don't even think it was a request, right?
Well, he requested, but he opened the door by changing the date on me. So it was when originally the story goes was I told him the dates that they had wanted for the retreat, I was already committed to another mission, and so during a meeting of healthcare workers and people from all over the Philippines in a program sponsored by the Archdiocese, the Archbishop announced that I'll be returning in October to direct the priest retreat, and so that just shifted all the dates. So it really is funny, It
is, and it worked out.
It worked out fine. So I was able to shift things and move things to accommodate the Archbishop's request.
Well, today we're going to be talking about Planned Parenthood and International Planned Parenthood. Obviously, the two go together because Planned Parenthood, the 108th anniversary of its founding was next week. So I thought this was a good time to kind of start talking about that subject. We have a whole ebook on it, which I will link for our audience if they want to download, which is all the reasons that Planned Parenthood should be defunded and kind of exposing its darker side, obviously. I mean, most of it's a darker side, right?
Right.
So let's just start with why is it important for pro-lifers to know and be able to talk about the problems with Planned Parenthood and the history of its founding?
Well, as the ebook will definitely go through, it goes through a number of myths. And I think what's important is that for our listeners and for people in general to be aware of not only the history and, of its founder, Margaret Sanger, but also, what does Planned Parenthood actually do? What are its services, in a sense, quote unquote, services? And many people really only hear one side of the equation because the media and social media and even the government, which is heavy-handed in this conversation, controls the narrative. So Planned Parenthood kind of gets shielded, from the public arena, on what it's actually doing and what it's, quote unquote, offering to women in need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And being able to talk about, so when people hear things like, oh, Planned Parenthood, women need Planned Parenthood for their health, you're able to say, actually, there's other services that women can turn to for health. And this is the things that Planned Parenthood does. They actually don't offer mammograms. They don't offer ultrasounds.
Correct.
But they do offer abortions. So
Correct.
Being able to talk about that.
And I think that's important. It's just for people to be aware so they can debunk, a lot of the rhetoric and the narrative that's out there. And you just said, Colleen, is that mostly the services that Planned Parenthood, both here in the United States and then the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is now obviously working all across the world in 145 countries, mostly is offering, reproductive, quote, services, i.e. contraception, sterilization, and abortion, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit.
Well, and also something that I discovered recently is that Planned Parenthood's the largest provider of testosterone for girls who are, quote unquote, transgender in the United States. So that was a side of it that I'd never heard of. You hear about it in the pro-life movement in relation to abortion. And apparently there's a detransitioner who's suing them for not giving her, there was a 30-minute consultation, and then they prescribed her testosterone. And she took it for a little bit of time and has health consequences because of it, obviously. And she's suing them now saying, you didn't give me enough care. So that was just interesting to me.
It is, and I think it's good for people to kind of be aware. And a lot of times, as I said, because the narrative is so controlled and they're shielded, and the realization is how many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that Planned Parenthood receives from the federal government of the United States. So you have a large, machine working on its behalf. So it's hard for people to hear. And also when they do hear, immediately there's this narrative that comes out and circles around Planned Parenthood to protect, this so-called industry. But it's important. That's why I like our ebook, because it really walks through, those basic myths It gives a tremendous amount of linkage to articles and resources that people can go and verify for themselves. That it's not just HLI saying this about this organization, but there are legitimate resources there, to verify and confirm what we're saying.
Well, that was one thing I really tried to do when we were writing the ebook, as I was putting in the sources, and I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just linking back to articles on our website, which then have links to other places, but I was trying to make sure the links in the ebook were directly to the sources that people could go to. And I got a chance to look through a bunch of International Planned Parenthood's things from the 60s and just see how much money they were spending in the rest of the globally at that point. And then it was interesting to compare it to what they spend now. And
also just with all of that is that you're asking kind of, why should people be aware, not only in the pro-life and family movement, but just in general, why should people be aware? Well, just in our own neighborhoods. Many people drive by, many malls or, these little makeshift offices and don't even pay attention to what's in those little venues. But oftentimes you'll see Planned Parenthood here in the United States could be under its own name or it could be under another name. And so people just kind of drive by and not notice. And then someone mentions, hey, that there's a Planned Parenthood facility down the street? Oh, I never knew that. So it's also good for priests and pastors and people who are involved in their religious communities to be aware of it so that people can then say, are you aware of what they actually offer? And we know as the ebook will go into that a massive percentage, of people that are impacted by this are within the Black community and within the Hispanic community. And this is where Planned Parenthood really aims its, quote, agenda and its so-called quote-unquote services, so which we can get into in a little bit. But it's just important for people in general to be aware that, and as you mentioned, some of the services that are offered, they're offered, for example, that maybe they need a woman who wants prenatal care. Some of the Planned Parenthood facilities will offer that, but most of them don't. But there are other places where women in need or a person that may be in need of prenatal care, she can go. Don't need Planned Parenthood. And so, but most of the work, the dominant work of Planned Parenthood revolves around sexual reproductive rights or services. And that's what we're talking about.
Well, and what you were just saying too about how other women can go other places to receive care is important, because if people will talk about how the government should defund Planned Parenthood. And if it is defunded, it's not that women are losing access to care. There are many other places that women can go for good, authentic care.
Exactly. So, and that's one of the myths.
Be aware. Yes.
If Planned Parenthood were to disappear, oh my goodness, women would not have access to medical care and so-called reproductive care. But that's completely false. And the ebook does get into that in great detail. But just the idea of people being aware, and so that here in the community where we live, closer toward, we're here in Front Royal community, but you're moving toward Manassas and Fairfax and start moving toward the DC area, it's good for people to be aware that these services are out there and, and actually what are they doing? What are they offering? And for people to educate themselves so that they know how to address it and how to speak to the issues in their own community. So it's very important to become educated.
Yes, definitely. So let's start by talking about Margaret Sanger, because she was the founder of Planned Parenthood. And I believe that Planned Parenthood a few years ago tried to distance themselves from her by saying she was racist. But Can you just talk about why it's still important that pro-lifers know who she was, what her driving philosophies were, and whether or not those philosophies are still present in Planned Parenthood's work today?
Exactly. And I came a little bit prepared in the sense to kind of give some dates. So it's always good to, keep in mind. So Margaret Sanger was born in 1879. Okay. All right. And she lived into 1966. The year I was born. And so she lived a very, very full life. And she, when you look at the ebook, of course, we give a good timeline. So I know you're going to have that linked and for people in the notes. But when you think about her approach, she came up in a very difficult situation in her family life. I think it was one of 11 children. And so in a hard, difficult life. And obviously this influenced how Margaret approached life itself. And it influenced her thought in a way of thinking of how to address poverty and how to address the issues that she and her own family may have faced. And so it doesn't excuse, but it does kind of help us understand who this person was and what motivated her. And eventually, as we would go in time, her ideology, her way of approachment really became more eugenic. And so we'll talk about the racism issue a little bit more, but let's talk about the eugenics first. It's really looking at a particular segment of society and determining that, that society would be better without that particular segment.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in Margaret's, and I have several quotes that we can pull from, and I take this from her, My Way to Peace. This is in 1932.
What a title.
And so she says the centerpiece of the program, was a compulsory sterilization and segregation. So this meant it targeted people with mental or physical disabilities. So here you're looking at a particular segment and saying that society would be better if we could eliminate these particular groups of people with these disabilities or with this particular, whether it be mental or physical. Now, the language we don't use today, but this is the quote. The first step, quote, would be to control the intake and output of morons, mental defectives, epileptics. Then a larger class she starts getting into, and she starts naming, so into criminals, the unemployed. So I pulled another article that I thought was very interesting that we could be talked about, is when you look back into the 19th century and you realize that this mindset that you just brought up was there. So I pulled up a map.
Okay.
And this is of states. Now, this is from 1935, so long before you and I were ever even a glimmer of a possibility in our parents' eyes. They themselves not around. But the idea was, when you look at this, you had, several states. Here, this map shows which states actually had laws in effect from January 1st of 1935 that dealt with eugenical sterilizations. Now, I know our audience, it's listening to us and who are watching us won't be able to see this if I put this up. It's small.
If you send it to me, I should be able to put it
Absolutely.
up. At least I'll link it in the description if I can't put it on the screen.
And then they had states that were pending, and so like states like Texas, Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania had pending laws. So what happened is that, for example, in California, it's from 19. The date was just showed you. When looking at people who were incarcerated in certain groups of people, many times women, a lot of times men, how they forced sterilization upon them. And it was not something that was in a sense, requested. These are things being done to other people.
Do you know what groups of people would have been targeted by those laws?
So that would be, here, so I can pull up one of the little quotes here. So this is in 1909 for almost 70 years in California. So this was basically led the country in the number of sterilization procedures performed on men and women, often without their full knowledge and consent. Approximately, they say 20,000 occurred. Now, the article just talks about those who are disabled, mentally ill, so that'd be a mental disability, and so basically also those who were incarcerated. Mostly that's where you would see a lot of it. Okay. But you had laws on the books, and people don't realize that the mindset of the 19th century was, looking at trying to eliminate, and I'll give you an example. So for our listeners who like law and want to look toward the law. So for example, in 1927, this is called Buck v. Bell. And I'm going to read to you what this decision was, an 8-1 decision in favor of overturning a Virginia law, right? So this is what happened. So this is about Carrie Buck. That's where the name comes from. Carrie was a quote unquote, this is how it's written, feeble-minded woman who was committed to a mental health facility. Buck's mother and daughter were also mentally disabled. It was believed that the mental affliction was hereditary. According to the superintendent, Pretty then Bell, that's where Bell comes from, of the mental health facility, recommended sterilization of Buck. So the court overruled a reversed decision, and the court ruled 8-1 that Buck could be legally sterilized under the Virginia Sterilization Act. And so people, again, by looking at how this mindset that Margaret herself was very much a part of, and if you read much of Margaret's writings, her various speeches, you will really get a very clear picture of a woman who really believed that certain segments of the population needed to be eliminated or not allowed to produce, quote unquote, reproduction, and or to limit their reproduction. And eventually you would see her mindset start aiming, and that's where some of the racial things begin to come in, that people try to push toward her. But she really was a negative eugenist, which means that she was directly aiming at a group of people, wanting to reduce their ability to reproduce.
Okay, so negative eugenics would be keeping people from reproducing in the first place. Would positive be killing them, like the Nazi Germany concentration camps?
Well, I mean, there's different ways of defining it, but for her, she's actually seeking methods and mechanizations to be able to make it happen.
Yeah, so I guess I was just asking because I've heard there's two different types of eugenics, and I couldn't remember what the names were. So you were saying negative, so I was just saying one is seeking to stop people from reproducing, the other is seeking to kill them, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's how people would define. I mean, I've always seen more of a reference to her in a sense using that negative.
Okay.
So, but we can always like to put them some in the notes or maybe link to people.
I think it's mentioned in one of our articles. I just can't remember.
That'd be awesome. And it's slipping my mind at the moment how to define it properly. But you look at this, and I'm going to actually found a quote here that when you look at the even the words of the Chief Justice. And how they approach. So there was a mindset within the American culture, if you will, that really we're looking at how do we deal with these particular groups of people within our culture, and so this is still with us today. I mean, it's definitely much a part, and you see this now in Planned Parenthood and how it influences. And so, as I said earlier, when you look at over 70-something% of Planned Parenthood facilities are placed within the African American, the Black community, and in the Hispanic community.
Is that their facilities or just their mega clinics?
They're mega clinics, but even the individual clinics, you'll find them, very heavily populated in those areas. And of course, in the global scene, all right, this is again where they're aiming at those who are in underdeveloped parts of the world, more specifically, and actually offering senses that if you decrease the number of your children, you'll be more economically better off, and so forth. So this mindset is still there. This is all from Margaret, Sanger, that now still is very much a part of Planned Parenthood's mentality, even though it's trying to distance itself from the eugenist side of the equation, and trying to make it more of a reproductive health and in services. But it's hard to disassociate yourself from the root of the problem and the mindset that actually gave birth, to Planned Parenthood itself, and how it is moved forward in time. And even if you still read, much of what Planned Parenthood's vision and mission is about, you still have a lot of the tone of Margaret Sanger there.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the philosophy of Margaret Sanger is still very much the philosophy of Planned Parenthood, even though Planned Parenthood is trying to say we don't want to associate ourselves with her, even though she founded our organization.
Right. Since, for example, we have a square in New York named after Margaret Sanger. So you have people that still celebrate, the so-called feminist, and really she doesn't really represent true feminism in the sense of really seeking ways to help women. And as we know in our ebook does get into very clearly, is that Planned Parenthood, one of the myths, is that if we have much more access to contraception, then we will decrease the number of pregnancies and will decrease the demand for abortion. And we know that to be completely false, all right? And the stats, even their own stats, even the Guttmacher Institute, which used to be obviously the voice and research arm of Planned Parenthood, still is, but just now separated from it. But still, its data shows that you increase access to contraception, you increase a mindset of that I'm going to be protected in some way from an unwanted pregnancy. And then obviously when that fails and one is pregnant, what Planned Parenthood offers? Abortion. So you can see the linkage. It's very clear, and it's an undeniable reality that again, because Planned Parenthood is shielded, and the narrative of even right now, the Biden administration, very clearly defends and advocates on behalf of Planned Parenthood. And anyone that exposes anything of it is immediately debunked, and you think of all the various kind of investigative investigations that have happened, that have happened, over the years, and all of a sudden, these are the people that are drug into court for exposing, the selling of baby body parts, or exposing what's happening behind Planned Parenthood, or the corruption within the system.
Lila Rose and David Daleiden.
Correct. And so all of a sudden, they're the enemy, and not the one that's really doing this. And so this is what we see. Now, we see this on the global side, Colleen, because we see how the United States, through its use of money, its federal funding that goes through the United Nations and other agencies. We know that, as our ebook will definitely outline a little bit for our readers, is on the National Security Study Memorandum, NSSM 200, which is the Kissinger Report, nicknamed, which people are shocked to realize that this country, in order to protect its own interest, advocated, very much like we've been talking about, for sterilization, contraception, and so forth, in nations that, we don't want their population to increase because we want to stabilize the United States politically and economically. And so that mindset is still here running in our state policies. And so it's very important to your original question, why should people be aware? Because this is a serious matter, and it's affecting human life all across our world, and because of those in power, that this evil continues to exist. And so that's why, we are working with pastors in communities, especially here in the United States, who in their communities have a Planned Parenthood facility. They themselves may not be aware of what services are being offered, because Planned Parenthood doesn't put on their front door, we offer abortions. It'll put language that masks what they actually offer. And so many people just don't know. And they believe the narrative, not because they want to believe the narrative, they just believe the narrative until someone exposes it. So formation education is key, to this, and to be able to debunk those myths, but also to really get to the heart of what's feeding this.
You keep anticipating my questions, because my next one was going to say, what does Planned Parenthood do globally? So can you just talk to our audience a little bit about the work that Planned Parenthood does globally and how it affects the mission work we're trying to do?
Right. So, so go back to NSSM 200. It's a mouthful.
I'm going to try to do an episode on that in a few weeks for its 50th anniversary in December.
That'd be very good.
So keep an eye out for that.
And we know that Henry Kissinger died, and it was so we talked about that in one of our podcasts. And so when you look at the document, it's actually listing countries that we need to make sure that we we start working on depopulating, decreasing the number of people. So Planned Parenthood and its international federation really plays a heavy hand in this,
which Margaret Sanger helped found as well.
Exactly. And so we know that it was the committee on, at one time, and it eventually became International Planned Parenthood Federation. So when you look at what its agenda is and what it's aiming for, so it's pushing contraception. And just to kind of step back, and I wrote it down so that our audience would remember something about dates. Dates are very important. And we take for granted now that contraception is just an accepted practice. And of course, as Catholics, we don't accept this. We know it's an intrusion against a great good, which is conjugal love. And that's a different episode, and we've talked about it several times. But up until 1965, so go back in time, the Comstock laws an act. So people can go back and look that up, all right? And it's actually mentioned in our ebook. You give some resources and links to it. But here, what you have in 1965, this is what's called Griswold v. Connecticut. And this is when on the federal level, where the Supreme Court, in its decision, said that, contraception for certain situations for married couples would be permissible. Okay, so I'm giving a short summary. There's a lot of history to that. But then what you find in 1972, which is now the Eisenstadt versus Baird, this is where now it shifts, where non-married people have a quote-unquote right to contraception. Now, for us today, in this culture that is so, in a sense, in the mindset of, of contraception, mentality of it, They realized that when Margaret Sanger, this was illegal. So when Margaret began to start talking about this in those early years and pushing for access to contraception, especially among certain segments of people, remember her mindset wanting to depopulate. She got herself in lots of trouble. So it really is Margaret played a very heavy hand in bringing eventually to what we have in 1972. All right, 1965 and 1972. So where we decriminalize access to contraception. Now, this opens up the door for Margaret's philosophy to become fully alive. There's no limitation now. And so what will eventually happen is now we can bring this mindset mentality, not only into the local level in the states. Now we can bring this mentality into the international market, which began with a very small number of countries participating. Originally, I think it was Sweden
or something like that.
And eventually grew.
Yeah.
And it's always, now, I don't like this language, Colleen, first world nations, which means the developed nations. I don't like this language, but that's the language that is used. And so, because in many ways it's the developed that are really the underdeveloped. Right.
Well, I believe it went back to the Soviet Union. I think it was first world, second world, and then the third world was countries that weren't affiliated with either the U.S. or the Soviet Union.
Right.
So that was the original origins.
Right, and then it became economic and so forth. And so, but it's just the idea of how these countries of elites, in the sense where economically they were strong, they were politically strong, they were obviously militarily strong, and so, but they were again uniting with each other and aiming their actions, their intent upon the underdeveloped nations, the nations where great poverty, and also where was this mostly aimed at Africa and Asia, and so looking at certain segments of people. Sorry.
I was going to say, can you just tie in then? So we were talking about the Kissinger report, which was by Henry Kissinger, and it's the U.S. government policy. And then we were talking about Margaret Sanger and her promotion of birth control and International Planned Parenthood Federation. Can you tell our audience why those two are connected? Because that seems like two separate things at first. It's a government policy versus a private organization.
Right. Sorry. Threw it out there and didn't explain it. So when you look at the Kissinger report, because it was looking at things from both a political, social, but mostly from a military, in the sense, how do we protect the interests of the United States, especially as we not only want to maintain our own stability economically, socially, but also militarily. How can we keep other countries from growing? How can we prevent, access to resources that we would need, and so forth and so on? All outlined in the Kissinger report. Still state policy today. Still state policy today. So Kissinger, in the report, outlines, I believe it was 9, perfect number of countries. Philippines was one of them, for example. All right, where we talked about where I will be going soon, and you can see how these countries were targeted for depopulation. Now, the United States, even at the time of Kissinger, couldn't use federal funding, right, to be able to advocate. So what they did is they worked through agencies. They worked through non-governmental organizations or through other nonprofits or so forth to advocate on our behalf. So you can see how today, how the United Nations itself is an instrument that in the World Health Organization, how these are being used to target. And so when you look at how Planned Parenthood functions, the mentality is the same. Its reasoning for doing it is different because Margaret began with a very clear mindset of looking at depopulating certain segments, back to eugenics, where in the Kissinger report, it's not necessarily looking at ethnic backgrounds as much as looking at those what they had deemed a threat to the United States, which you can see how they can be wed together because it fits perfectly well into the mindset of International Planned Parenthood that wants to also decrease the population. It's aiming at those who are of certain ethnic backgrounds now. That's where people now come into the racial component because you can see it's aimed at segments of the world that are either in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, all right?
And it's interesting too because Planned Parenthood will say that those groups of people not being able to access sexual and reproductive rights or sexual and reproductive health is racist. And it's just interesting because it's like if you realize that you're saying you shouldn't reproduce and we're going to kill your children, it's really racist to target those groups of people. Right. So it's just this interesting, like, throwing it back in your face, where it's like, no, you're the racist for not wanting these people to
Right,
have
exactly.
abortions.
And also, what's interesting is that the other great lie is the amount of millions, billions of dollars. Dr. Brian Close, in much of his research, just showed how many billions in dollars have been spent on population control. And now what we're seeing is a demographic winter. And you hear many people talk about even countries that are not going to be able to survive because they have so depopulated. And so people now seeing the negative consequences of this. But in reality, think about how those resources could have been used differently. So, and how they could be used to give people access to true care, to true medical care, to true accompaniment, to give them resources to be able to provide for their families, their communities, to give them infrastructure. This is what Centesimus Annus talked about with John Paul II, in the 100th anniversary of the encyclical Rerum Novarum. He's talking about what is the obligation of the global community, and so very different approach, because we start with the dignity of every human person, and that a person is an end in themselves because we're dealing with a human person. And so how do we serve human persons? Imagine if those monies would have been used in a different way, that where we can help people. And that's what I love about our church, because that's exactly what we do, and many others do in a good way. So
imagine if we brought water and helped drought-stricken areas with irrigation rather than bringing them contraception.
Or teaching people how to do agriculture, or giving them farming equipment, or bringing electrification into certain communities, or providing infrastructure of good bridges and highways, or just genuine health care that starts with human dignity, not the destruction of the human person, or treating human persons as we treat cattle when we speak about depopulation. We're not, this is not, and that's some of the language that's in there. And Dr. Brian gets in it so vividly when you look at the letters and the people involved, International Planned Parenthood, the president of the Federation, and you read what they're saying. Or when you hear people, like Margaret, talk about the Negro population, using a term that she would refer to, and that's all outlined in our own document. But I have other things here that just show, especially her own speeches, her own language, and we know that in many ways others picked up on this on the international forum. That obviously we know after the Second World War, eugenics became very, very, people were aware, and they saw what happened in the Nazi camps. They saw what was happening in certain places around the world, and it really brought people's attention, like we're trying to do today. Let's talk about it, and it exposed it, and so it really became very unpopular. But in reality, it's still here through Planned Parenthood. It's still here through many other groups that are working in the same philosophy. And let's be honest, our own federal government, through its own policies, that are pushing, for these so-called services. Where are they aimed? Who are they aimed at? And we have a very tainted history in this country that, that people are not aware of, from the 19th century and going forward in our own actions and experimentations on human people and so forth. And so we should never turn, a blind eye, to these things and how they still linger today. And so I know our ebook really does give, and I really appreciate, the work of the staff in this, to show the percentages and to show the actual numbers and the amount of money and the amount of resources being allocated toward this agenda of this one single organization that exists primarily for the promotion of contraception, which I kind of translates literally to promiscuity, or just in the sense of being able to act without any consequence, and eventually ends up with, abortion as the one that is given. And we also know that Planned Parenthood, both nationally and internationally, also are very strong advocates of promoting sex education.
That was going to be my next question, is could you talk a little bit about sex education? Because that is actually something that I wish we had covered in the ebook. We did an amazing podcast episode last December with Monica Liao Klein, who used to teach. She was a sex educator trained by Planned Parenthood. So our audience should definitely go back and listen to it. I re-listened to it this morning preparing for this podcast, and I forgot how much amazing good stuff was in there. But yeah, talking about what their role with sex education is and why it's problematic.
So we've had several podcasts on this, and I've written on it, quite a bit on both sides. In a sense, our church does speak about the importance of the proper formation catechesis of our young people, and that's the role of parents as the primary educators in helping their children to understand the beauty of what it means to be male and female, and to understand the beauty of sexual love as God has so designed, and that within marriage, where conjugal love is celebrated and has responsibility, and we talk about that. And that's then you have the flip side of it, where we see people like Planned Parenthood and others advocating for a very perverse understanding of education in the sense of regarding sexuality.
Well, Monica was saying that the fundamental philosophy of the comprehensive sex education course, which is the one that is most basically taught in America and also
Correct.
globally, is that children are sexual beings. And that doesn't necessarily mean obviously we're born with sex organs, but that's not what she's like, I'll get pushback because people say, but we are. And she's like, that's not what they mean.
No.
They mean that children can and should be able to have sex.
That's correct.
And be able to consent to it even with adults.
Exactly.
And obviously she's not saying that each individual person who teaches is like a pedophile, but that is the underlying philosophy from Alfred Kinsey, which is driving the comprehensive sex education program.
Right. So I think, it's good for, when you think about that. So I've seen it with my own eyes in textbooks in different parts of the world, from 4-year-olds, as young as 4-year-olds. I've seen some even younger in textbooks, where they basically are introducing young people, children, to sexual expression, and as you just defined, basically is being able to act out in any manner that whether another person accepts, in all these type of things. But you can see what that does, Colleen, without getting too graphic. And that's why I'm kind of hesitating on what to talk about, because it's the idea that when you see what they're introducing to young people, and what does that mentality now create going forward? It creates a framework. And eventually that framework begins to realize that basically it's about pleasure, it's about gratification, it's about expression, without any responsibility, without any sense of discipline or self-restraint. That we are a people that are made up of emotion. We are a people that are social beings. We are sexual beings in the sense that we are male and female, and within the proper understanding of that, we do express ourselves through that reality. And so, but also the words of discipline and restraint and understanding, using a rational ability to reject those temptations or to respond to those temptations. But if we teach young people that basically anything goes, we can see how that will now move forward and advance. So basically, we're now preparing these young people to be sexually active, to be promiscuous. And what will those young people need as they grow forward in time? They're going to need protection from the consequence of a sexual act. So we now have the use of contraception that's getting introduced. And we actually show 4-year-olds how, and I've seen it with my own eyes, on videos being taught in the schools, and how they're teaching them how to put a prophylactic, a condom on, and how to use it, and so forth and so on. These are 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Then you start seeing how this moves again forward. Also, what does that now also create? Now we have sexually transmitted diseases. So now we have another, quote, industry that's where we got to address. How do we address the fact that if you're sexually promiscuous, that the possibility of contracting a sexually transmitted disease is very possible. So Planned Parenthood, well, I'm here to help you with that. I'm here to help you now. Let's say that you find yourself with an unplanned pregnancy, all right? You weren't anticipating being pregnant because you thought that the use of the prophylactic, i.e. condom or IUD, or maybe the injectable, or maybe the chemical hormonal you're taking, was going to prevent you from ever being pregnant. But whoever told you that? We would never. But that's the mentality. We're telling you that you'll be free. Well, now we have something else we can offer you, i.e. the killing of your child. So this is where Planned Parenthood is. And no matter where it tries to hide behind the narrative, the stats, the numbers are telling. And as you just said, quoting from work of Live Action and many others, that are out there that are exposing people who come from that other side, talk about what happens behind those doors. And we see that from our own sidewalk counselors. We hear the stories. We know it. It all gets shielded. But the truth is still there. And people need to realize is that this truth needs to be more exposed And it's not just HLI doing this. There's so many that are working this. But on the global side of the equation, on the back to the sex education, this is a challenge for us because when working with parents, because parents want to believe that the government has their best interest. And we also know that because of many countries now have their own educational systems and have their own laws, and parents are, in a sense, forced to enroll their children into the school system, that at times parents may not hear what their children are being taught. They may not see what their children are being taught. So part of what we do is help parents to take on the responsibility as the educators of their children and to make sure they see what their children are being shown. Talk to their children about it. Help their children to understand. But I will tell you, it's a real battleground because the only way, if I may compare it, and I may get a lot of pushback on it, from others, but the idea is that it's like a pimp. Planned Parenthood works this way. In other words, is that I'm going to give you a product, promise you all the sky, but when it fails, I'm going to be there to take care of you. So basically, by getting kids hooked on this, here I'm going to use this drug, on this behavior, they're guaranteeing they'll be there for the future. In other words, Planned Parenthood is just guaranteeing that they will be here still.
That they will, quote unquote, need Planned Parenthood services.
Right. We have, because if what happens if we were not here? You wouldn't have those services. Well, let's take that and move it around. If we didn't have that group pushing this mentality, and if we just step back in time, and I know it's hard for us because we are conditioned in this moment, but if we just step back, we've always had temptations. We've always had an abuse of God's great goods, right? So it's not like we didn't have pregnancies 200 years ago outside of marriage. These things existed and temptation existed. But what we had was also a very Judeo-Christian culture. We had a very clear religious culture, a family-oriented culture that respected these beautiful boundaries and understood them. And so, but now those have been unmoored. And so when you unmoor it and you disconnect it from its root, from its understanding, this is the inevitability. But to realize just 100 years ago, in this country alone, if we think about what were most Sundays like for most Americans, what were most Americans' view of marriage? What were most Americans' view of family life? How did they approach it? What value when they said, I want to be married one day? What was their vision? What did they want in marriage? When they thought about, I want one day to be a parent, what did that look like? So now that those mores, kind of those foundations have been kind of basically somewhat, I say destroyed, but they have been so compromised that people don't think now. So we have another mindset that's crept in. Margaret was very much a part of that. And many others with her, that began to introduce, the whole issue of right to birth control, But what people didn't ask is, why is she so concerned about it? What was driving her philosophy? Time would tell us, right? So she had a clear agenda, an ideological position that was very clear, and it was aimed at a certain segment of population, and that now migrated into where we are today. And it's so important for people, to read. So I'm hoping that ebook will be helpful to people, and they ask questions, and maybe we can talk about kind of narrow our focus in a sense, and maybe talk about a specific area.
Yeah, definitely.
That might be helpful to people.
Leave questions in our audience. Leave questions that you have in the comments, and we'll try to do episodes on those topics. Anything you want to hear more about in this area.
Yeah, because it's just there's so much.
Yes,
there's just so much. But I mean, when I was studying for my degrees in bioethics, one of the courses was constitutional law. So that's kind of why I brought in this as one of my overviews. But, when you look back, and this whole one is on Griswold, it's on the Einstein, and it's on Buck v. Vell. And you think about, this is 1927. People, what? 1920? That's not too long ago.
That's like 100 years ago.
That's right. And you think about in California, 1909, 70 years. It means 1979. You still had laws on the books.
Wow.
And people, so it's not that distant that we realize what we have done and what we're still doing. And we should not let an organization that tries to pretend it is something else when we know exactly its root, and to try to disassociate itself from its founder. Well, the only way to do that is to denounce her completely. We've removed in society the names of many people from buildings because of their history. And we can argue whether that's right or wrong to do. It's still part of our history. And so Margaret is part of American history, but should we be honoring her? Should we be celebrating a woman who was a eugenist, who really, when you read what she said and what she wrote, it's very clear, what she believed. And to have an organization that still to this day tries a little bit to distance, that's not, it has never distanced itself from the foundation and the mission and the vision of Margaret Sanger.
Well, even if they denounced her verbally denounced her, that wouldn't mean anything if her philosophy is still what's driving their work today.
So that means that would have to change everything about it, which would mean what? It would have to close its doors or
totally redo what it does and pivot entirely to actually offer healthcare to women and not abortions and contraception.
True healthcare.
True healthcare, yes.
Which, as you said earlier, we already have institutions to do that. So why do we need Why do we need Planned Parenthood?
True. Final question. You were talking about your upcoming trip to the Philippines. Could you tie that into, so you're saying the Kissinger report targets the Philippines. That's one of the areas, and the Kissinger report meant that the U.S. government was funding Planned Parenthood to work in the different countries.
Right.
Could you just talk about how this upcoming mission is part of the great battle against Planned Parenthood's agenda?
Sure. Because, from the Kissinger report, from the work of groups like International Planned Parenthood, and there are many groups like that working all around the world under different names. Right. Yeah. And so when you look at depopulation, so when we go back in 1965 and we look at the Philippines, which is the dominantly a Catholic country. And when you look at in 1965, the average size family, Colleen, was about 5 children per family to the current moment. So where you're looking at barely at 3. So now what you're seeing is the depopulation, the mentality having worked, because the United States, after the Second World War, began to introduce, more access to contraception. And so abortion is not legal in the Philippines, though we know it's happening. All right. But contraception is very much trying to be legalized. And still to this day, it's a battleground. But obviously, people have access to it and are readily available in the country. The government itself there in the Philippines is pushing for it, making it more readily available. We've had a program member on, Mayor Sally Lee, of one of the great cities in the Philippines, who really changed our city structure, where as a government, it was not advocating for contraception, but advocating for, abstinence, advocating for continence, advocating for marital love and openness to life. But this is not throughout the country. And so what we see is the consequence of this mentality and the programs through USAID and many other groups working in the country that are trying to change the mentality of a people, who love life, who love family, and who love God. And it's a challenge now. It's a real challenge.
So then why, can you just explain for our audience why training priests and medical professionals is so important?
Right. So it's like anywhere else around the world. So we have to understand the good. What is the good? And so here we're talking about what is the good of life itself? What is the good of the human person? What is the good of marriage? And what is the good of family life? And so by working with seminarians and priests and religious and lay leaders is to introduce them or reintroduce or to support their formation, to help them understand why our church teaches what she does, and then how to teach that teaching, how to be an advocate for that teaching. Now, working with government officials, which HLI does in many parts of the world, is how to do what we have been talking about. Let's flip the whole thing over. What if we were providing services to truly accompany families, truly walk with people and help them by proper formation, proper catechesis? If we were working with parents, helping them, supporting them in their responsibility, and not working against them, if we were providing, services that really supported our understanding of the human person, and our medical interventions and our therapies all reflected that, it would be a very different scene. But what we've created, I mean, I just heard it's a different subject, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but I read something the other day that I need to verify much more. That's why I haven't really written on it yet, is in the United States, there's a certain age level now of older people that now have sexually transmitted diseases, and it's growing exponentially in the sense of people who are now older than me, who are contracting sexually transmitted diseases. Why? Because of promiscuity. So you're thinking about what happens when we lose sight of how I am to act. And as you said earlier, that, those that worked on the other side, when you talk about us being a sexual being, what I mean by that and you mean by that is very different. And so to me in the Philippines, that's what we try to do. We try to bring those who are going to be teachers, formators, the catechists working in the barangay, in the communities, who are working with couples and helping them understand, how to live, this beautiful life that God has given, and how to respect other people, how to respect one's husband, respect one's wife. These are all ways, but if no one has the conversation, then another person controls the agenda. And with our media today that is so accessible through the phones, internet services, computer technology today, the movies that are out there, everything is hitting them with something different. And because these things are just literally so accessible, Colleen, that we're fighting up against a tidal wave. But I have seen the inroads. And, when I meet people who walk up to me and said, Father, I met you 12 years ago when you gave a talk on conjugal love and conjugal life and what that meant. And today, and so they'll say, my marriage is so strong today because we're living the life that God designed for us. And we're happier. And then you'll meet couples that were contracepting and said, no one's ever talked to us about this. No one's ever mentioned this to us. And then they'll say, here's, the little boy, that since you were last here. It's such an uplifting moment because you see the fruit of it. And you realize this is what real happiness is.
Have they ever named the kids after you?
No one's named them yet. So, but I think in many ways, I go back to what I started with. It never condones Margaret's philosophy and all that she did, like Henry Kissinger and many others. Nothing condones what they did. But when you understand and look back at, and I think of Saint Therese of Lisieux's family, a very large family, and you read their history and you realize the mom and dad became very holy, all the family became saints and blesseds, and you look at, they had not an easy life, but they embraced the beauty of life and the beauty of walking with God and trusting in God, and look at the fruit there compared to the vision that Margaret had, which undermines that great desire, that great purpose, that beauty of life, and so much so that valued certain people arbitrarily. You have value, you don't have value. We have to annihilate a certain segment because of a mental disability or a physical disability, which eventually moves, okay, well, if I can do that on that particular group of people, what about those that have been incarcerated? How do we treat them? Let's move that now to another segment. How can we deal with people that are of lesser means? Or well, now we can move it into an ethnic group. Well, let's look at the African American community. How can we need to decrease that population. You start looking at what arbitrariness does. We're not arbitrary. And when people live truly in that beauty, doesn't mean it's easy every day. By no means. But it's fulfilling. You see a purpose, you see a reasoning, and you welcome life. And as I've said many times in my articles, Colleen, people who want a true adventure, if you're called to married life, get married. It's a true adventure with someone to walk with and to welcome life, not be afraid of it, and to welcome all the beautiful personalities that are going to emerge from that openness to life. You want an adventure? That's an adventure, but to close oneself off, that's not an adventure. That's cowardly. It's not taking an opportunity to embrace the fullness, the beauty, the wonder that is in front of us, and responsibly, of course, always responsibly, and taking accountability for one's actions. But the idea is just trusting and believing. This is what we try to help people to see, and how the contraceptive mentality is such a negative, and what it creates What is its fruit? Again, we're a Catholic apostolate. So let me speak from a Catholic point of view. Jesus says, judge it by its fruit. What has Margaret and Planned Parenthood produced? What do we see in those that are living the beauty and the wonder and the good and the happiness? There's a good friend of mine who works with young adults and helping them to live the beauty of the single state and to live chastely and in continence and to live it beautifully. She says, you'll never have to worry about a sexually transmitted disease. And if you wait until you're married and live beautifully in a monogamous relationship with your spouse, you'll never have to worry about that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's how simple it is.
Yeah. We've had Dr. Joe Malone on the podcast multiple times, and he talks a lot about how sexual integrity is sexual health. Like, if you're living chastely, then you are going to set yourself up for your best physical health and your best relationships.
Amen. So back to we need to close down, but you look at this is that's what I'm saying, it's such a vast topic.
Yeah.
Because you look at the millions, billions of dollars we spend because of sexually transmitted diseases that can be easily rectified. But no, we have these so-called rights, these privileges. No, it's a very bad understanding of the human person and of my responsibility to myself, but also my responsibility to others. And so I think this is a great way that we can broaden the conversation and talk a little bit more. But I hope our listeners will go to our ebook, take a look at it, ask questions, but look at this before you ask the questions. Read the sources. Go back and look at them. And I can give you this, Colleen, later, some of the stuff I brought that you can always link if you wish to the notes. And that way people can go back and even read, what some of that history is.
For sure, definitely. And I'm going to link the ebook on the end page coming up and in the description as well for our audience. So you can go download it. And Father, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm just really glad to be able to talk about this. So thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to the next moment.
You too. And to all of our listeners, please like, follow, and subscribe. Check out the Planned Parenthood ebook that I'm going to link for you and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.